Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the third panel of CSULB's two-day series of events discussing racism, anti-Black racism, and pushing our conversation about what is ought to be done today. Before I introduce you to today's panel and the objectives of this session, I want to quickly thank some of the people and the organizations that have helped to put this event together. I want to thank Doctors Anthea Butler and Kevin Gannon for the national call for scholars to actively and intentionally engage in these conversations. I want to also thank the faculty on this campus that have come together to put these events together and organize them, especially Doctors Kimberly Walters, Melissa Masico, Doctors Lily House-Peters, Araceli Esparza, Rigoberta Rodriguez, and David Schaefer. I also thank the faculty, the California Faculty Association, the Union of Faculty Members across the CSU system, especially its leadership at Cal State Long Beach with Doctors Deborah Ham, Gary Heitreck, and Becca Langen. Thank you also to the Academic Technology Services, especially Preston Wingrove, Francisco Romero, and Cheryl Hathaway for helping us and assisting us with all of these events. Thank you to the Faculty Center and Dr. Malcolm Finney and Gabriella Kavanaugh. And lastly, I want to thank the CSULB administration for their continued support, including and especially Dr. Christy Fleming, the AVP for Faculty Affairs. But most importantly, I want to thank all of you all who are here with us and are taking time to be with us. You best believe that we would much rather have had this conversation with you all in person, to dialogue and talk in person and create the spirit of urgent, critical, and politically engaged scholarship that we most desperately need in our current moment. What we want to do today is address a couple of questions. We want to think about and see if we could develop, and these conversations are we're only going to be able to touch the surface of them. So please, we apologize on our end for not being able to delve into the depths that is required. But the world is complex, but it's also simple at the same time. So we'll address the simplicity of it all. So we want to address three main things. We're going to try to develop or speak about issues of criminality and policing. We want to introduce and define the concept of abolition and why it might be needed today as a strategic way to move forward, and introduce ways of thinking about political change in the current conjuncture. Conjuncture meaning what is happening today. But we want to speak about what is happening today with the understanding that the present is not disconnected from the past, that the past lives within the material conditions of the present. And we want to talk about the present moment today because we're interested in the future. But we're interested in the future not as some absolute break from the present, but a future that is being built right now. So we come to you today in solidarity with the embattled streets of Los Angeles, Chicago, DC, Kenosha, Minneapolis, but not just in the United States, with London, Paris, Gaza, the West Bank, and everywhere else around the world in which you see the slogan of Black Lives Matter being put up front and center. So with that, the way we're going to move forward is we have three people that I'm excited to share today's conversation with, and they'll have a conversation. I'll pose some kind of open questions for them to address to kind of help guide the conversation. And that'll take us probably till 1:50, 2 o'clock, at which point I'm going to try to ask the questions that you all as audience members are asking us. So please feel free to raise questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to them and raise them to the entire panel. So again, our apologies for this kind of virtual format. It would have been much better if we were all in person, but this is what we got. So we're going to do the best with it, right? So that's going to be kind of the format of today. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then after that, kind of start us off, right? So I am really excited to be able to introduce my and also proud to say that they're all my colleagues here at Cal State Long Beach with all of you. So our first speaker, our first panelist is Professor Deschaine Dozier, and she is a professor assistant professor of geography here at Cal State Long Beach. She is completing a book on how poor people abolish the penal organization of their lives by envisioning and planning for a better Los Angeles. She joined the Beach in the fall of 2019 as the assistant professor of human geography. She completed her doctorate in environmental psychology at the City University of New York. Our second speaker is Professor Abraham Weil. They are assistant professor in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at California State University Long Beach, and the general co-editor for TSQ, the Transgender Studies Quarterly. His area of focus are Black studies, trans theory, continental philosophy, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, affect studies, sexuality studies, and feminist theory. His current project, Transmolecular Revolution, Transversality and Mattering of Political Life, focuses on radical political formations in the US and France from the 1960s to the present. And our third speaker is Professor Stephen Osuna, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at California State Long Beach, California State University Long Beach. He received his doctorate in sociology with an emphasis in Black studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an MA and a BA in Chicana studies at Cal State LA. His research and teaching interests are racial capitalism, globalization, transnationalism, and immigration, policing and criminalization, and Central American studies. So it's an honor to be here with all of you. And I forgot to even say who I am. My name is Yusuf Bakr. I am an assistant professor in the Department of International Studies at Cal State Long Beach in the College of Liberal Arts. Even though we have many supporters and we have many people who've put this event together and have helped to put on this event, we speak for ourselves. We do not speak for the university. We do not speak for our departments. We speak for ourselves. So I think it's important to mention that. I want to begin with kind of a first question that I want to have our panelists address, and maybe we could start with Dr. Deschaine Dozier. The question that I have for all of you is the current civil rights movement, which is the Black Lives Matter movement, was a response to the murder of Black folks. From Trayvon Martin and Oscar Grant, to Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, to Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Whether it was police or vigilantes, the death of Black brothers or sisters, our Black brothers and sisters, was happening without any regard. The legal mechanism wasn't doing its supposed job, and the police who were responsible for the violence inflicted were not being held to account. But in every direction, when protests occurred, the question that emerged was the question of violence of the protesters, and specifically of Black folks. So somehow, as protesters raised the question of murder and violence and disregard for Black life, and the national response by most elected officials, Democrat and Republican, this ain't just a Republican issue, was the continuation of the discourse that pathologized the Black community. So with that said, I wonder if you could lay out for us, if all of you could lay out for us, what are some of the key things that we should be thinking about when it comes to the question of policing and the discourse around criminality and deviance? I'll throw it first to Dr. Dozier and then Dr. Osuna, and we'll, yeah.
So thank you everyone who organized this event and everyone that's tuning in. I want to start off with talking about policing as a system of managing labor and population. Policing was modernized in Europe to punish and regulate Irish workers who repeatedly striked and resisted labor conditions. And this legacy grounds us today as policing is connected to practices of labor management. And in the United States, the formal establishment of policing has always been connected to colonizing the land we stand on and managing the labor of imperial economic projects. So policing and caging is part of the legacy of chattel slavery and indentured servitude. Policing went hand in hand with managing Black people, working the crops in the South and regulating Black folks' movement for the agendas of producing economic profit from the crops. White supremacy through lynch mobs, vigilantes, and the police all worked to regulate the movement of Black people who often resisted, rebelled, rioted, labor conditions, and dehumanization. In the West here where we are in Southern California, Kelly Lytle Hernandez shows this in her book about Southern California and how colonization was intricately linked to policing and incarcerating the Tamvang Gabrieliano people. So policing is not so much about criminality as much as it is about establishing labor control. And Black people for some time have been stuck in a surplus or impoverished labor population, and policing is the result of managing that population and in that continued legacy of the United States.
Thank you for that. Dr. Osuna, if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, well, first of all, good afternoon. I hope all of y'all are as safe as you can be at this moment. You know, I see a lot of familiar names and I'm excited to see y'all. I just give y'all a virtual hug from afar, right? You know, at this moment, I'm in my house, but I'm in solidarity with the essential workers who make the world go round. The protesters in the streets protesting the violence of policing and uplifting Black lives. The anti-fascists fighting the reactionary churn in this country. And the rebels in the global South fighting for their dignity against imperious plunder. So I want to keep all that here with me as I talk about what we're going to answer these questions. So I'm happy that I'm in a good I'm with good colleagues in this conversation, right? And I'm excited about that, right? I'm in good company, and I know I'm blessed because of that I'm in this roundtable with you all. But so building off of my colleague here, what she just said, right? Thinking about labor control and the policing, you know, I'm currently on parental leave right now, so I'm not teaching any classes, but I usually teach critical criminology in my sociology classes. And critical criminology, I start from the position that this is a radical critique of what we think is crime and criminalization and criminals, right? As the question that Dr. Bakker asked, right? The discourse around criminality and deviance. That's exactly what it is, the discourse around this, right? But what are the material conditions that produce what we think is crime and criminality, right? And that's the part that Dr. Dozier just mentioned, right? That gets masked, right? For me, in this current moment, I think we are living in a system that prioritizes profits over people, the rights of property over the rights to live a dignified life, right? But that has always been contested. And I tell that to my students, that the policing that we see today is always a reactive response to people fighting for dignity, for labor, as Dr. Dozier was talking about, fighting for their rights, right? For the peasants who lost their land, fighting for their rights to the land, for indigenous people, fighting colonization, right? Slaves rebelling against their slave masters, breaking their chains, right? The policing has always been a response to that, right? So in this current moment, we're seeing an upsurge of that again, right? A response to a decaying system, a system that can't support us, right? A racial capitalist system that wasn't meant to provide for us. It was meant to exploit, oppress, right? Enslave, disappear us, right? So I think policing has always been a system that's responding to the needs of the people, and not in the way that we want it to, right? Not a system that provides needs like healthcare, education, right? Dignified life. It smashes those things, right? Policing is a system that's meant to blind us from these conditions, right? And when I teach my classes, my students, it's always an interesting contradiction that I want them to think about. Like I ask them, and not all of our students are working class students of color coming from these neighborhoods that are over-policed and underprotected, right? And I ask them, do you trust the police? Most of them say no. That's a very basic statement. No, I don't trust the police. But who do you call when you need help? And there's a contradiction, the police. I don't trust them, but I have to call them, right? And so this contradiction here is what I try to unravel in my classes, right? What got us to a point that we don't rely on ourselves as communities to take care of each other, that we rely on an institution that we don't trust, that since our childhood, we felt uncomfortable, right? And this is a reality that a lot of us are living in. And I think in this moment, the upsurge, the police, the protests, the rebellion, which word we want to call it, is waking a lot of people up to this, right? But I want to remind us that this has always been there. People have always protested this. People have never accepted this, right? And those that have accepted it is either because they weren't paying attention or because it benefits them, right? And so I usually start with this quote, and I know I can share the screen. I start with this quote in my classes. Give me a moment to share my screen. My classes start with this epigraph. And before I get into it, in dealing with this subject, the commonest curse is to be the dupe in a good faith of a collective hypocrisy that cleverly misrepresents problems, the better to legitimize the hateful solutions provided for them. Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism. Aimé Césaire was discussing colonialism. But I try to remind my students that the criminal justice system, policing, is an apparatus that emerges from this colonial system that Aimé Césaire was talking about. And that we cannot be dupes in a good faith of a collective hypocrisy that misrepresents the problems of the capitalist system that doesn't provide for us, to provide the hateful solutions of policing, caging, deportation, to solve its problems. So when I think of policing and the discourse of criminality that you just, and crime is that, right? Like that, how does the concept of crime really blind us from looking at the real root causes of the problems that we're dealing with, right? And of course, there's concerns of public safety, right? But when we think of crime and criminalization, it's not solving public safety. It's really warehousing people into the prison industrial complex, right? So I want us to think of those terms and keep Aimé Césaire close to us when we think about the hateful solutions of policing, caging, and deportation.
Thank you for that, Dr. Osuna. Dr. Va, I'm mispronouncing your name, man. Can you tell me again?
Wow, you got it. Thank you three, for teeing us up and setting us up. I want to thank everybody for being here and all the organizers. It's great to see the amount of work a small group of people can really put together and get done. It gives a lot of confidence for these things that we're talking about, that we can start making some moves forward, right? So what I'm gonna do is share a PowerPoint and go through some kind of opening remarks that address Dr. Bacher's sort of opening provocation, and that's gonna transition us to the next question. So I'm gonna share my screen with you. So what I want to bring to the table today and try and fold into our conversation is lining up some connections that for me are about the relationship between Blackness, transness, and abolition. So I'm going to start with Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism, which is here on your screen: the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So what I want to think about with this definition is the sort of key functions of racism in this broad way, which is one of the questions that we're going to tackle, right? And so Gilmore's giving us this definition, and it has some specific main points attached to it, right? It's state-supported, it's built on exploitation, it impacts our life chances. And I'm going to fold in here Roderick Ferguson's understanding that race as a construct, right, is the way that institutions differentiate and classify. It's also the way that we then interpret and internalize those classifications and differentiations, right? So, oh, sorry, that's the second part of that. So the second part of the Ferguson names the process by which people internalize these logics. So I want to be more specific here and talk about anti-Black racism, right? This definition on here is sort of my definition that I work with. And I think it's important to sort of name racism and name anti-Black racism as two things that are working together, co-constituting each other, but have different paradigmatic aims, right? So to sort of get to start answering the question that Dr. Bakker poses to us, and Dr. Dozier did a really great job of situating us here in the here and now and the spatiality of the questions that we're asking. But through discourses on criminality, we're often then held responsible, right, for making bad choices along the way or failure to take better care of ourselves, right? I actually even heard a little bit of this sort of talking about in the narrative in the first panel. But at the meta level, right, a lot of these charges that we encounter around laziness or poverty, as it associates with Blackness, or deviance or trickery as it gets associated with transness, are really about the sort of mundane ways that anti-Black racism is predicated, or that the United States is so predicated on violence, and that anti-Black racism is the kind of thing, this labor control, right, that was pointed out to us earlier. And as a nation sort of built on the enslavement of Blackness and the dehumanization of Blackness and the fungibility of Blackness, right, to mold, to move, to make do whatever the will of power might be at the time, right? That once slavery ends, right, the afterlife of that anti-Blackness, of that dehumanization has to get pushed out into other places. So if we think of anti-Black racism in this sort of contemporary moment, this is air that's been pushed into the balloon, into a section, right? And it might be more mundane on some days, and it might look like murder on others, right? So I want to turn to Angela Davis really quick and think about the ways that anti-Black arrangements help us to understand that the paradigmatic target of racism is Blackness, right? That it has to target Blackness in order to catch all of those other biopolitical categories of difference, in order to catch even the sort of discourses of model minorities, right? To pit racial sort of differences amongst each other. That, to me, is an example of racism taking its target as Blackness, and that people then move in the wake of that. So if we're thinking of Blackness as something that's moving in our contemporary moment through the Middle Passage, through diaspora, right? And we're thinking about the ways that it congeals around that and around those ways that then get transferred into these sort of carceral logics, right? So Angela Davis gives us this quote recently where she asks us, if we want to develop an intersectional approach, that the trans community is going to show us how to do that. It's a big statement, so I want to try and sort of piece some of it together for us so that we can think about where the registers of the biopolitics of gender and the biopolitics of race are kind of linking up and where they can't link up, right? So she asks us to sort of rethink this, and here I'm conceptualizing transness in the most broad and capacious way, any sort of wide-ranging gender practices that sort of violate, to get us to the bottom of this quote, right? Quote, if it's possible to challenge the gender binary, then we can certainly effectively resist prisons and jails and police. The big question for me about abolition, right, that she's giving us here is a four-step process, right? And this one taking from critical insight, that's prevention, intervention, reparations, transformation, right? Those four things that can help us to prefigure an abolitionist politics that might include thinking about both gender and race as logics that are used by the state for labor control, but being specific at the same time about the ways that these arrangements actually do matter, right? That we can't just say racism and not attend to the specificity of anti-Black racism. We can't think of intersectionality without Blackness. There's no way to do it, right? And so as we sort of get to this question that Dr. Bakker asked us, and I'll go ahead and restate it. Sorry, I meant to skip ahead. He asked, can you lay out the key things that we'd be thinking about when it comes to policing and the discourse around criminality, right? So I want to lean on Roderick Ferguson again, who again says race both accounts for the logics by which institutions differentiate and classify, include and exclude, and names the process, this is the key, names the process by which people internalize those logics, right? So if me, a Black trans man, has had to deal with my internalized anti-Blackness, my internalized anti-transness, you too out there may have some work to do, right? So the discourses of criminality and deviance that stalk these lives, stalk the lives of Black folks, of trans folks, of Black trans folks, all of these are sort of ushering in these rhetorical justifications of dehumanization, right? Links to violence or animal-like behavior and forcible encounters with the state, right? And by forcible encounters with the state, I mean constant policing practices that force our bodies to encounter the state more regularly than other bodies, right? So we're playing a numbers game. If I get pulled over twice, and you get pulled over once, there's twice likely that I have an incident, right? So thinking about these sort of forcible encounters that ultimately fortify these sort of incarceration systems, right? The quote on the screen right now is meant to sort of get you to think about the ways that the mundaneness of anti-Blackness or anti-transness, the banality or the quotidian effects of everyday experiencing anti-Blackness in some way or anti-transness in some way, for me, are really about laying the tapestry, creating, bringing together, as Dr. Keith said in the previous panel, bringing together the ingredients, right, that we need to produce these outcomes. So far from exceptional, right? These are just everyday kinds of things that operate in this banal space so that when murder happens, right, that can be the exception instead of the rule, right? So to sort of minimize the banality of everyday anti-Black racism means to exceptionalize these moments of intimate violence, right, that are really heartbreaking and are hard for us to experience, right, but they're not exceptional, and that's the problem that we're dealing with, right? So I want to sort of think about these discourses of criminality and deviance really quickly and then sort of move us out. These are just two ways that I think are helpful to think about anti-Blackness and transphobia. I'm not going to use them. Instead, I'm going to lean on Sarah Ahmed's definition of feminism, or one of her many definitions of feminism from Living a Feminist Life, where she says feminism is simply how we pick each other up, right? And for an abolition politics to prefigure an abolition politics, we can start to think about the ways that health systems are care systems. We can start to think about disposability and criminality and deviance and innocence and freedom and all of these sort of ongoing discourses that have become very clear to us. So I'm going to end by thinking about the sort of ways that I see us kind of prefiguring abolition, leading to starting to define. And again, I really do like that critical insight 4-step program, right? But prefiguring solidarity always means to think about abolition as processual. That means that the end is as important as the means to get there, right? So as an ever-evolving project, the means by which we practice abolition are as important as the end goal of abolition itself, right? And that's where we get the sort of 4 steps: preventing harm, intervening on harm, right? Having processes to repair harm and violence, we could call that reparations, right? And transforming communities and relationships, and we can call that abolition. I think we get there through systems of care, right? Processual solidarity that leads to these sort of logics of prevention and intervention rather than labor extraction, exploitation, and incarceration. Guiding principle for that, right? Nobody is disposable. That's what we're saying when we say nobody gets put in a cage. Nobody is disposable under any conditions, right? And part of that is heartbreaking work because people bring harm to each other, right? Which is the sort of second guiding principle that comes from Gilmore again. Nobody's innocent either, right? To be in relationships means to do harm, to be accountable to those harms that we've done, right? That's abolition. So resisting generalizations and assumptions about certain groups, right, is a really easy way for you to understand, how can I know if I hold these biases? Well, do I think a certain generalized thing about a certain community, right? Those are pretty easy ways to sort of start breaking those down and shifting the questions. So to sort of close out my open framing, it would be the sort of shifting the questions toward avoiding red herring arguments, right? Well, what if the criminal, you just want all the criminals to be on the street, right? This is the great fear that is touted by the right and the left alike, right? It's this idea that if we open prisons, it's going to be free for all and everybody gets murdered. I always tell my students, I don't have an inclination to murder, and I bet you don't either, right? So if we can think about the conditions in which those things are produced, we can sort of start to shift the questions away from these big what ifs, right, down to the what about how we live our lives now. and then giving the people who are most affected by those things the center seat, right? That's not hard. I am, if not the only, one of the only Black trans faculty at this university. That is all I need to say about that. So the last part, right? Those people will always disagree. When we get together, part of it is to disagree on the platforms that we're working with. And we can speak to those who are willing to listen about the conditions of their life. And I leave you with that for now, and I look forward to the conversation. These are three colleagues that I have a lot of deep respect for, and I'm super excited to have the chance to talk to you all in what has been such a lonely, lonely time. All right, thank you.
Thank you for that. I definitely feel you on the lonely times part. There was a lot there, and so there's a lot of kind of questions that you all have opened up and insights that you all have opened up. So my apologies to you and all of the audience for maybe closing off some of this as we transition to our next question. But for me, like, it struck me, the question of relationality as opposed to distinction and difference is key. I think part of the logic and epistemology of white supremacy and racism is to differentiate distance, distance everything, whether it's time, the past versus the present, whether it's space over here versus over there, or whether it's people, us versus them. So I want us to kind of pick up on where you just left off and talk about the question of abolition even more. So in the context of the conversation that's happening nationally, there is the buzzwords or the buzz phrases that you often hear is you have police reform, defunding police, and abolition. Can you all maybe help us understand what those refer to? And within that, what are the limitations or maybe the strategic importance of each? How should we kind of approach those questions? Because I feel like the second you engage in the conversation, you're asked, well, do you want to defund the police? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? And so, like, how do we think about them before we are put in this position to be reactionary? Why is abolition maybe a concept that protesters and politically engaged critical scholars have been pushing forward? So maybe we'll go back to, I'll throw it out to any of you, but maybe Dr. Dozier, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So thank you so much, everyone. So far, I've been enjoying this discussion. So I have a collective understanding about how each of these words are different. And I want to sort of break down what is central to my framing around this. And so an important framing to think about change or institutional change, if you will, is Andrew Gorse's notion of reformist reform and non-reformist reform that was recently popularized by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And this pretty much states, and you could kind of apply it to our circumstance now, right? So reformist reforms currently that are often pushed through mainstream discourse are reforms that alter or tweak the system of policing. And examples of this include sensitivity training and body cameras, right? But each of these examples of tweaking, right, more socially inclined police officers or recording of actual incidences actually expand the system of policing. And so the problem with this is, and why for, I would say, the last 8 years, defund the police is now on a national and global scale. And 6 years ago with Eric Garner, Michael Brown, there was the same call to divest from the police. So this is indeed not new, but it's more popularized now, thank God, right? So defunding the police has meant to reprioritize our governmental budgets by shifting our values about what it means to be human. And the value of our capitalist system is to cage people. And this caging moves beyond the site of the jail cell. My work is on homelessness, for example. And homeless people often cycle from the shelter bed to sleeping on the streets to the jail cell in literally a 6 month time span. So that last site that Abe had about care, the question that we're posing and we're shifting our question is, wouldn't it be easier to actually just house homeless people? What if we shifted our priorities and our values to provide care and not cops, right? So this is a movement of folks have been saying this for the last decade, the last 2 decades, for example. So defunding the police is a strategy of abolition, right? It's a strategy. And abolition means to reverse unfreedom. This means to abolish the conditions that produce unfreedom. And it is in both part of our abolishing our investment into criminalizing people, violent forms of differentiating people that ultimately are part of the span of criminal justice or so-called criminal justice that dehumanizes people. And ultimately it's moving into a transformative justice approach or a system of care and humanity that Abe just eloquently pointed out. Questions of no one is innocent, right? No one is disposable, and having those as our central principles and values and how we actually allocate resources, allocate our priorities in governing or in collectivizing our lives, right? And so that's what's really important about this moment, and I'm very excited about it. It's not a surprise that we are using the word abolition after the reconstruction of the US in 1865, right? It's not a surprise. This country is built on capitalism and colonialism, and abolition seeks to undo these conditions of our existence that, as much as Abe talked about our prefigurative politics, as we engage in this moment, we also have prefigurative conditions. And so that is the central connections that people are making across the globe and have been making for decades, centuries. So I think it's important to ground that this is a continued tradition and legacy. It is not new. And yet we have so many tools and skills and robust imagination, literally like at our fingertips, right, to learn and engage in this.
That was so well said. I don't have anything to add. I just wanted to yes.
Yeah, that was great. So, you know, the good part about being in my desk is that I could pull out my books and be like, this is what you should read for this, right? So we got to read, everyone should read this. There you go, right? We both pulled it out, right? When we're talking about abolition, this is what we should read first, right? To understand what we mean by abolition today, we have to look at the history of the term, of the struggle for it, right? And this is one of the things that we should be reading. Du Bois talks about what he called abolition democracy, right? The elimination of institutions that harm and developing institutions of care, right? Socialized education, socialized healthcare, socialized housing, right? Now, at this moment, a lot of people are scared of the word socialism, but it's socializing these things, right? Is what we're talking about when we talk about abolishing, right? We abolish these institutions that are not really productive. Policing is not productive, right? It's not producing good for the people. It's actually maintaining a status quo that we're all struggling with, right? So when we talk about reforming the police itself was already a reform. So you keep on reforming something that was reformed, right? Right? It was before we had the military. Well, let's have a civilian institution that'll police, right? But even then, the idea of serve and protect. So, because sometimes my students, right, the idea of serve and protect is a oftentimes hurt word that's thrown around. You see it in the police cars. ... Serve and protect ... And I remind my students, what's that ... Who are they serving and who are they protecting, right? And for me, we look at its origins, and Deschanel started eloquently with the origins of the police, right? Where in that is it serving the people? And I mean, when I say the people, I mean, again, the essential workers, right? The families that are making this world go round. How is it really serving them? And maybe it serves them by masking the inequalities and telling us the problem is that criminal and that houseless person in front of your house, and you need us to protect you from them, right? Rather than saying, no, you know what? You should be organizing in your community for better education, for better housing, right? The landlords, we need to go after the landlords who are charging you rent when they shouldn't be charging you rent in this current moment, right? The police ain't policing that. They're policing poverty. They're policing houselessness, right? So when we think of abolition, then again, he reminds us that the development of this of eliminating institutions and building institutions. So oftentimes, folks, and Ruthie Gilmore and Angela Davis remind us of this all the time. People get stuck with abolition of just getting rid of something. It's about building something. It's about an alternative, right? So abolition is about one element of it is getting rid of it and starting something else and building something else. That's already there in our social. We're social beings. It's already in us to be social, to care for your neighbors, right? To love each other. That's already there to take care of each other. We're social beings. But in this current moment of the last 40 years of neoliberal restructuring of the society we live in, and what I mean by that is that we've privatized a lot of elements in our lives, right? We privatize, in some countries, the water is even privatized, right? Austerity measures that have cut social programs like healthcare, education, right? Mental health institutions. And sometimes even those institutions are harmful, right? The mental health institutions. But as Abe was talking about, there could be alternative forms of care of in those institutions. But once we eliminate all those things, right? Once we eliminate jobs that provide livable wages, that provide a union, right? That provide the ability to take care of your family with an income and pay your rent and still have money to at least survive. You eliminate that, it creates hostility, it creates tension, it creates stress. It creates all the problems that we're dealing with right now, right? And our solution, again, is to call the police if you have a problem with your neighbor, right? Instead of just, well, all you know each other, right? I bring this up to my students all the time. How many of us talk to our neighbors? Do you know your neighbor? Oh, well, you know, I don't want to be nosy. Is it really be nosy, or is it like we create this private citizen, this private person that you don't talk to each other? And if you have a problem, again, call the police. Abolition is getting rid of that, transforming our relationships to each other, right? But going back to, again, the reforming the police. You know, again, the point is, right now, Biden is talking about community policing. That we don't need to defund the police. We just need more community policing. That's the word that they always use, thinking they're going to fool us by throwing the word community in front of policing. What I tell my students is, let's flip it. Policing the community. That's what it really is, right? It's not community policing. It's policing the community. It's just this word that makes us think that, oh, if you have better relationships with the police as a community, things will improve. But it's still not subverting power. The police still have the power in this situation. It's not community control over the police that will eventually defund and eliminate the police, because as you build community power, you no longer need an institution to police you, because the community is empowered to control their community, to control the decision making, to control the resources in their community, to think about where your resources are going to go. We don't have that power at the moment, right? So abolition is socializing our needs. Right? I really like, they say collective care, our collectivizing what we need. I think that's a very important word in this moment of neoliberalism, right? Collectivizing, right? Because we individualize, the police individualize this disorder, that gang member around the corner, that homeless person right there, right? That sex worker right there. Individualize, rather than looking at the conditions and the relations that produce our existence. Yeah? A lot of my work focuses in Central America and the criminalization of youth, right? And looking at the scapegoat and the moral panic over MS-13. And right now, Trump's, he loves to throw that out. When he wants to defend the wall, when he wants to defend deportations, he was saying that he's deported a whole bunch of MS-13 people. I don't know who are these deporting guys. I know a lot of families have been deported, and I know a lot of them aren't members of MS-13. But he could use that catch-all phrase, that folk devil, the MS-13, because there's actual real conditions that are causing harm in Central America because of the violence within youth. But by focusing on him, on the folk devil, I mean, MS-13, we never look at the conditions that produced it. U.S. imperial plunder in Central America. U.S. free trade policies in Central America. Border militarization funded by the U.S. in Central America, right? Privatization of resources in Central America, right? Mass deportations from the US back to Central America. That stuff is never in a discussion that, unfortunately, not even the mainstream media or Trump say this, right? Because even sometimes they try to, even corporate media will say, like, will give a lip service and say, well, you know, gangs, MS-13 started in Los Angeles because it was refugees from the war, and then they got deported, and gang culture started in Central America. Gang culture, right? It's going back to this Moynihan argument of culture, right? Gang culture was deported, sent back, and that's why the gangs existed. Actually, they got sent back when you ravaged the country, right? And then you imposed IMF policies of restructuring, right? Of privatization, of austerity measures, of deregulation. None of that's going to discuss. So I really appreciate the very beginning of this. Again, what's the discourse masking all this, right? And it's our role to unmask it, to call it out. Right? And abolition, I think, could do that.
Thank you for that, Stephen. And you know, I think as people are listening in, they're like, man, I thought this was about race. You all are talking about this and that and borders and stuff. And I think what's important for people to realize is that we live in a world that racism built. That racism isn't just something that is interpersonal. It is, but it's more than that. That the construction of modernity itself comes out of of racism, of differentiation, distancing of each other. And so the question of abolition is not about a question of working within the world that racism built, but on building a different world that is opposite to an alternative to the world that we currently live, and the world that we deserve, right? So I want to, with that in mind, the question I want to ask to further kind of deepen our conversation about abolition, I'm going to ask two questions together, if you all could maybe respond to them, and before we kind of speak to some of the great questions that our audience members have been asking. And I appreciate you all for asking those. So the question is, within within the sectarian nature of American politics, and the United States is a very sectarian country, too often I think that people view the notion of Black Lives Matter generally, and abolition specifically, as a Black issue. Can we think about, what does it mean? Can you talk to us about the power of anti-Black racism to structure the racializing process of people of color generally, and also of white folks? So, like, how is anti-Black racism not just about Black folks? And alternatively, then, how is abolition a way of freeing all of us as opposed to only some of us? And so, related to that question, in a sense, what maybe I'm trying to think about is how often anti-Black racism is reduced to simply a question of race, and race at a very symbolic level at that, the question of representation only. How does an abolitionist framework then push us beyond that to make visible not simply the racializing process, but in the way that you all have already been talking about, how we are gendered, how our class position becomes operationalized, and how our sexuality is used as a system and modality of control. And so then how does abolition get us to move away from simply naming things or attesting to it, or to performing our affirmation of those things, but connecting the way that we are signified by those things to the material conditions tied to that signification? So, like, how the world is created materially by the way that we are symbolically at the level of perception, naming and categorizing things. So I'll just throw it at you all. See who wants to maybe take it up first.
I can pick up from. I want to a little bit circle back to some of the things that were said, but I'll try and move us forward through this question too, or get us going. And the thing I wanted to sort of go back to that I think actually does help open up the next question is, Deshane mentioned something about how, started the wheels thinking about how there's this tweaking to expand, right, of policing, and Stephen marks how this happens through community policing, right? Dr. Sharon, who was on the panel before, whose work is on, policing and policing strategies, she actually sort of looks at the way that care, right, is something that the police really co-opt, and their discourses around care. This is a sort of a new thing that's kind of emerging, right? This sort of community policing, body cameras, as these techniques of caring for the community, right? Seeing like, police officers playing basketball in the neighborhood with like some folks, right? Those hugging images, right? Those images that are meant to make you feel good, right? They're supposed to give you the goosies, right? So those kinds of strategies that really are about the co-optation of communities of color strategies for survival, right? So what they're doing is they're becoming our aunties, right? They're becoming the people who then move through our communities and through our houses. And one of the major ways that this happens, to sort of get to the question that was asked, right, is this idea that in this sort of neoliberal moment, right, certain communities of color, certain queer communities are being recruited into the body politic, right? And particularly in the United States, where projects around homophobia or projects around racism have largely failed when we're talking about brown communities, Asian American communities, or queer, lesbian and gay communities, right? That got exported, right, to other places in the world. Those homophobia campaigns or whatever that we then exported because it wasn't working right here, right? What has ultimately happened is that we can use anti-Black racism to name very specifically the way that some brown communities have been recruited as usable, right? Usable by the nation, usable by the body politic. And we can also see this in sort of Trump's discourse around like X for Trump, right, is a way of marking that there's certain subjects that we're making legible, we're making possible, we're making livable lives for them. And one of the ways that the police do this so clearly is to recruit from those neighborhoods, right? To recruit cops of color or queer cops as a way of marking both progress and as a way of suggesting that they care, that they're interested in what we're saying, right? As long as what we're saying is we'll continue to pay you, right? There's no, the block becomes when we try to take away money, right? With these ideas of reform are important to conceptualize, but hit their natural limit because policing is not something that started from a different origin point other than labor control, right? So when we think about the relationship between Blackness and slavery, right? Blackness precedes slavery, right? Police do not, right? So when we think about the ways that the police have been used and to function in this way, and the ways that they are now surreptitiously, right, moving through in these ways, plainclothes police officers at protests, right, is a really good example of the ways that they have been allowed to move with impunity, right? And when we're talking about sovereignty, he who's sovereign can kill with impunity, right? This idea that we sort of carry of the sovereign. The sovereign is not the police, but the police can operate in a zone of impunity that allows them to do the bidding of the sovereign, right? So it's not that the police, police do not make a lot of money. These are not wealthy people who are just moving through the social ladder and becoming rich and famous, right? These are folks like us who got recruited under the banner of you can live a safer life if you are the one who is enforcing those laws, right? And simultaneously, that sort of neoliberal politic of if you're not behaving badly, you don't have anything to worry about, right? And this idea, this fantasy that if we're not misbehaving, we have nothing, okay? Or nothing to concern ourselves with. So when we think about the sort of moves towards abolition and the idea that this is a Black issue, right? The first cop that has to go is the one that lives rent-free in our heads, right? That's the first one that's got to go. And if you feel that you're a person who's made safer by the police, I recommend you have a conversation with that police officer that lives up there because they're not paying rent and it's taken up a lot of real estate, right? So as we sort of move to the next question, I want to open it up for the panelists. We got to think about the ways that as we are structured by these logics, we have to unburden ourselves from believing that this is the only alternative, because we haven't explored any in our entire lifetimes of anybody on this call, right? So now's the time to just try something different because it's not working, okay? You know what I'm saying? All right, I don't know, check to someone else over here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really just want to piggyback on also thinking about policing as not just like the officers on the beat, okay? Policing is an entire apparatus, very much so connected to the surveillance state. And our friends at Stop LAPD Spying is doing amazing work on this. Stephen Asuna had hosted a scholarly intersections event last year in September, where he had Hamid Khan speak about the connection between policing and surveillance and abolition. And so that's an important organization to check out. But a lot of the techniques and strategies of policing have been built on logics of anti-Black racism. Simone Brown's book, Dark Matters, talks about how surveillance technologies are built on actually focusing on and deeming Black people as already criminal because of their skin in order to then justify their practices of surveillance throughout our cities, at our airports, and other parts of the globe. And that's that same logic, right, that popped off or started, my slang coming in, from 9/11, which is really important, connects to this larger practice of imperialism and war. And so these things are very much so interconnected, how anti-Black racism and racism plays out and influences the systems that are developed. Stop LAPD Spying talks about how spying in LA and surveillance in LA, I can't recall of the specific program, but the way that they, the main categorical identity for one of the surveillance programs as the person who was criminal or a problem with were Black women, that this surveillance technology of reporting focused on Black women. And it was because people were calling and reporting Black women as criminal, right? And this goes back to the cop in your head that Abraham talked about. We both, as we're changing our systems, we have to change ourselves because we are part of it. We produce it, right? Like the systems are people. So we have to change ourselves in addition to, right, working, being out in the streets and doing other things to make these things possible. And I see myself as part of a tradition of Black liberation, and that is my life's work, to do rigorous research, activism, to wage protracted struggle to that end. And so as human beings, I feel as though it is all of our tasks to ground Black liberation and its intersections with Indigenous sovereignty, immigrant rights and protection, and show the intersections of our lives and what can be possible when we help each other get free.
You know, I want to, Abe really pushed me to, I want to show this picture of talking about recruitment of our communities into this institution of policing and forming the cop in our heads, right? I want to show this one picture from a report, you know, from the LAPD report. Look at this, you know, like it starts very young, right? Some people might see this and see like, oh, that's great, you know, keep them out of the streets, right? But what do they learn? Right, the police is not just an institution of repression; it's an educator. It educates, right? It forms a concept of the world, and as Abe and Deshan were saying, that concept of the world is fundamentally anti-Black, right? The criminality, the idea of crime, the idea of criminality, the idea of deviance, right, has formed our conception. It's formed of anti-Blackness. Now, thinking about this, and I really like build off what Dejane said, right? Oftentimes when people think of abolition and Black Lives Matter, and as Yusuf said, it was just, oh, it's the Black issue, right? Come on, dude, really, like it's an issue of life and death beyond a Black issue. It's an issue of life and death. And policing more broadly has to be tied into the idea of policing the planet. Christina Herriton and Jordan Camp have a really good edited volume called Policing the Planet, which has, it's talking about the development of the police globally, right? And how the exportation of policing tactics, right? And bringing back the policing tactics, right? Of learning counterinsurgency in Vietnam and the Philippines and Central America and bringing that back into our communities, right? So it works both ways, like a boomerang effect, right? But I think it's important to name that, because when we think of Black Lives Matter, and when we say Black Lives Matter, when we say Black liberation, we don't just mean that in the United States. I say Black Lives Matter in Venezuela, where the US government has sanctioned the country. And then those that are feeling it the most are Black Venezolanos, right? I say Black Lives Matter in Honduras, where the Garifuna people are fighting for their land against transnational corporations, right? I say Black Lives Matter in Cuba, where over 60 years, this government has created a genocidal blockade in the country, right? So I'm glad Yusuf brought it up earlier, like, oh, I thought we were just gonna talk about policing in the United States or race in the United States. No, this is not CNN. We're broader than that, right? We want to understand how global capitalism, imperialism is embedded in the world that race made, that Yusuf brought up, right? So I think we need to think broadly when we think of these phrases, right? And study this stuff, right? Actually, I really encourage us to study this. Like we pulled out that book, right? The alternative ways of living. We also brought Dr. Meiti Rojas and I brought Susan Burton to campus, right? To speak about a new way of life. Right? In this book, she's showing us an alternative, that no one is disposable, right? That oftentimes when someone's been deemed criminal or deviant, we don't see them as worthy of anything else. And here she's saying, no, it's not. Because you have to think about who even called this criminal or deviant in the first place. Okay? Again, I'll go back to this. The landlords that are exploiting people, why don't we call them deviant and criminal? Those that write those free trade policies that push 3 million peasant Mexicans off of the land, why isn't that criminal? So we need to reconceptualize when we think of these things, right? I also work with Homies Unidos, which is another organization that's doing alternative work, right? That's trying to say, look, we work with those that have been criminalized, with youth that all they were given was criminalization, right? And show them that there's an alternative. We need to work with these organizations, uplift those organizations, like A New Way of Life. Visions of Abolition is a documentary that I really recommend. I know some of y'all watched 13th in the morning. Now watch Visions of Abolition, right? Really good documentary that was made in 2011 about how to think about abolition, about how to think about the prison industrial complex, and really tying capitalism to prison making, to prison expansion, right? Because I think that's oftentimes it's lacking, right? Our analysis of race and class and gender and sexuality, right? Or, Stuart Hall always had this very famous quote that a lot of us quote: race is the modality that class has lived, right? Meaning that oftentimes our class experience, our class relationship is experienced through gender, experienced through sexuality, experienced through race, right? But it's always down tied to the material conditions of how we live our lives, right? And one thing I wanted to share, right? When we think of this, I had another quote I wanted to share. Let me find my slides. Again, I teach criminology, critical criminology, right? Let me differentiate. There's a whole tradition of radical criminology and critical criminology that's challenging dominant conceptions of crime. But even then, an abolitionist perspective would be that I eventually don't need to teach these classes. That we get to a point where we even abolish my own class, right? That's the point of this, that we teach to the point that I no longer need to teach this class. But we currently have a law and order president. We currently have fascist presidents in the Philippines, in Brazil, in Honduras. So it's desperately needed to teach these things at this point, right? But I wanted to show a quote from a radical prison intellectual named George Jackson. And in this quote, he shares that with us. He says, after one concedes that racism is stamped unalterably, and I'll say that's it, anti-Black racism is stamped unalterably into the present nature of American socio-political and economic life in general, and concedes further that criminals and crime arise from material, economic, socio-political causes, and I would say are ideological constructions, we can then burn all the criminology and penology libraries and direct our attention where it will do some good. Where it will do some good. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about abolition. When we're talking about socializing healthcare, education, livable wages. That's the good. Not investing in more police, in more border wall, right? In more foreign policy of militarization in Central America and the Philippines and Mexico. It's actually building systems of care that we desperately need here. And again, as I said, it's already in us to do it, right? It's already in us to be social beings. We just need to get the cop out of our head, but also the neoliberal out of our head, right? Because our institutions have taught us to be neoliberal, to just focus on me, right? Solidarity is fighting for those that you don't even know, but being in the struggle with them, uplifting their struggle. And so I think that's an important thing to think about when that question you're bringing up, Yusuf, right? About the fundamentals of this country and anti-black racism, right? That fuels the relationships and the political economic conditions of this country. James Baldwin always talked about that, right? When migrants get here, what's the first word they learn, right? I could feel the same thing with Latinx migrants oftentimes. Not all of them, but many of them come here and already have this learning the anti-black racism in this country, right? And have to unlearn it. And I really appreciate Abe saying that. There's a lot of things that we have to unlearn, right? We have to learn and unlearn. Again, that's a process of internal abolition, right? Unlearning things that have been embedded on us for so long, the fears that we've been socialized to fear, right? Because we might not even fear them, really. We've been socialized to fear them, right? That's important to think about.
Wow, thank you. There's so much there. This just speaks to the need for us to talk about this. I mean, I know folks are talking about it outside of campus, but within campus, this needs to be an ongoing conversation because there's so much there and so much that we could unpack. I also want to second, like everything Dr. Osuna said. Like I study the Iraq War. And for me, I've been dealing with stuff around the Iraq War since 2001, since September 11th. And now I am more convinced than ever before that to really understand what happened in Iraq, you need to understand the United States. And really to understand what's the policies of the US counterinsurgency in Iraq, you really have to understand what was happening specifically in Black communities and brown communities and around the issue of policing in the United States. There is no distinction between over there and over here. And when you live within an imperial context, the empire itself it becomes very important as a crucial place to study, rather than over there. There's always a projection. Oh, if you want to study criminality, then you want to study Black folks. When it's like, no, if you want to understand criminality, you have to understand the police. If you want to understand what is happening in Iraq, you don't have to understand Iraq. You have to understand the empire itself. You understand the United States. So for me, Black Lives Matter is a global call, and the issue of anti-Black racism is for me, it's an issue of the Middle East. It's a Muslim issue. It's an Iraqi issue. It's an Iranian issue, Venezuelan, Cuban, all of that. So it's important to kind of reject the distancing and the differentiation that occurs. Look, there's so much questions, so I want to put a bunch of them at you all, so you all maybe could help us get to them. And for all of our audience, like you all could get our emails, hit us up. We're around. We have office hours, and if not, so or I won't speak for my colleagues. You can hit me up. I'll put my office hours stuff on. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that folks have had that I've put up. So Nikki Mehtas, she says, this is where the spiritual deficiency in this country is visible if we saw each other as souls versus humans. And she asks a question about how can we think about abolition within higher ed framework? Like, does it translate within the schooling? And Alicia Robinson also asks a similar question. She says, how can community care be used in K through 12 schooling? And how can we work to incorporate these abolitionist ideas in the K through 12 system in a way that is actually accessible to everyone? with the cycle of poverty ravaging poorer communities, how do we make sure they are included? So those are two kind of concerns around education and abolition, if folks could respond to. And then I want to put forward a more general question that Benjamin Perlman asked. And Benjamin asks, so how can we restructure our law enforcement to keep our communities safe from the very few people who do commit crimes? I think and crimes might need to be redefined in this context, he says, but like, how do we think about that? So if you could, and if you all could, this is terrible of me to say, if you all could keep it like very brief, so I could hit you all with more questions. Thank you.
I can try and get some quick ones in there. In terms of abolition in higher education, I mean, I think we have a sort of natural alliance that is increasingly being extinguished by sort of neoliberal policy and like larger administrations at universities. And I think in our university in particular, we talk a lot about the diversity of our students and how that is mismatched with the faculty. And I think that this also sort of reaches back, right, to K through 12. I mean, something that I feel like I learned very early was like the 10-point program as a way of sort of thinking about some basic ways that we can understand education and health systems and life chances and stuff like this. So I recommend reading the Panther Party's Black Panther Party's 10-point program as a way of kind of conceptualizing how we can do this at a young age. I think there's a long history of Black families recognizing that schools are not teaching our children, and they're certainly not teaching our children their histories, right? And there was an attempt to sort of liberate those students and start doing community schooling programs, and having those programs that would give young Black children their history ultimately led to a lot of the sort of truancy policies that we have now. A lot of the constraints around homeschooling come from this sort of moment, right? And a lot of the kind of pushing to de-link that history from formal education, right? And so we have that sort of the afterlife of that in higher education. I know I'm in WIGS, right? Gender studies. We're constantly under threat of not being good enough, or having to prove ourselves, or having to have more students, or not being valued for the kinds of critical scholarship that we do, right? And what we do is teach students not how to have answers, but to how to ask questions and how to question these sort of systems. We give them this language of neoliberalism, of incarceration, and they leave the class feeling very comfortable diagnosing the trauma of their life, right? And I think that for me is, how do we think about these sort of liberatory structures as part of education? It starts early, it starts at home, but it also is about the university, like putting up or shutting up, like, do you want to support it or do you not want to support it? And I need some receipts, I think. So, I mean, I think that there's a feeling for me as a Black faculty member that it's not something that's valued in the university beyond the sort of discussions of valuing it in the university. And I don't know if other people feel that way, but my instinct from doing this teach-in, being part of the larger network that's doing it nationally, and that we're just kind of, we're making the argument that we as Black folks need what everybody needs: health, safety, access to resources, mutual aid, all of those things, right? And a lot of that comes down to what Dr. Dozier was saying about shifting our priorities, right? And so to get to that last question really quick, which is to say, if we shift our priorities from thinking incarceration is the only way to address harm, right? If the only way we can address harm is to put people in cages, I think that that's unimaginative, right? That we can come up with different programs and systems, and indeed Black communities have done this for a really long time. And if we look at the history of organizing around gender and anti-racist issues, right? So the feminist movement and the anti-racist movement that work side by side, Black women always were at the front of Black feminists theorizing about the ways that we cannot be made to choose between parts of ourselves, right? And that the issue that we're bringing to the table about anti-Blackness, just like Dr. Bakker said, right? This touches all kinds of other issues. So I'll wrap there. Sorry if that was long.
Awesome. Benjamin, I would just say read The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. It provides useful alternatives about alternatives to policing, okay? and law enforcement. And to the first question, Cal State Long Beach is heavily anti-Black. We have a small Black student population, it's 2.5%. We have been active this summer in response. The university has responded to the moment by taking attention to Black people on campus, right? But Black people have been on campus for quite some time. So I think we have a heavily anti-Black campus. We don't have a scholarship for Black students, just for them, not a social justice scholarship for all students, a scholarship for Black students. We don't have that, okay? And as this moment continues to move, the university I see is mobilizing towards a more centralized mainstream idea around social justice, not abolition, and not a focus on eradicating anti-Blackness specifically on campus. The president has made some agreement about responding to Black faculty and staff's demands for changes, but agreements and practice are different. So, and it's just like what Abe said, are we just going to be talking about it, or are we going to be doing it through just a 2-day scholar strike, or actually changing the culture of this institution, right? That historically doesn't get Black students, historically hasn't invested in them. So that's something that I'm very interested in changing. And I'm also not invested in that as my focus of organizing at the institution. But I do that through my teaching and through my mentorship. And that's my role as a faculty member, and it's up to everyone's role to engage in that. The UC system there is a cadre of people throughout the UC system that's calling for no cops on campus. Through this moment over the summer, there has been a more focus on Long Beach as a whole, right? Long Beach, the city as a whole, and not Cal State Long Beach and its cops, which is historically doing what we've been talking about, right? Producing anti-Black racism on campus. So we have a lot of work to do, and whether or not we want to have that conversation and actually do that work is something that is important, is a grave issue right now. And that's across the nation.
So go ahead.
I was just saying, the question was about how to incorporate abolition into the educational system, right? So I think for me, one book, I want to recommend the book before I answer, but Damien Sojourner wrote a book called First Strike, Education Enclosures in Black Los Angeles. It's really about the educational system from K to 12, right? And really critiquing the school to prison pipeline. Right? Because the idea is that it's a school that's sending you to prison, saying, actually, no, the problem is the school. It's enclosing Black youth, right? And preventing them from actually being all they could be in themselves, right? It's criminalizing them, even from the very beginning in the school. It's not necessarily preparing them. It's already happening there, right? So the educational system there is a concern. Now, but there's a lot of grassroots organizations that support teachers in that process of challenging that, right? And I think that's something, if this person that asked the question is going towards education, is going to be an educator, I really recommend you be part of a community organization outside of your job, right? You're going to be teaching, you're going to be a teacher, and you're going to find the limits, like we as professors find the limits of what we could do within the restraints of our job. But there's community organizations that could push those limits from the outside, right? So for me, for example, in the communities that I come from, there's an association of Raza educators, right? That organizes teachers to push for different forms of education. Not only doing popular education outside the university, outside the school, as Abe mentioned, right? But also trying to fight for better policy within the school, right? And I just go back to the point of what y'all were sharing at the university level, right? That we need to fight for more of that, as everything that was just said, right? And support that as professors and support our students, our Black students, in our university. I remember when I first started, I asked a similar question: what's the demographic of the Black students? Because I know it's Long Beach. And, when they told me it was like 3% or 4%, I was like, really? Like, what's going on here? This is Long Beach. This is LBC. We all have the word LBC in our head because of what we listen to in music. Yet we're not supporting Black students, or uplifting Black students here, right? So there's a lot of work to be done there. And again, it could be done through our teaching, but it also could be done through community organizing. I think that's a very important element, right, that we need to bring up. Every time someone says something, how can we change this? Community organizing, right? Abolition as a concept, as we've been talking about it, is not just conceptual, right? You know, California went through a huge prison building project in the history of the world between the 1980s to the late 1990s. What stopped it? Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us, abolitionists. People stopped it, right? They would have kept, we would have kept on building prisons, but it was people on the ground, organizing, agitating against these conditions, right? So in any concerns that we have, if there's students here, if you have an issue, we need to organize against these issues, right? And I think that's a big thing to think about, whether it be at the K through 12 or at the university level, right? When people have power, it's because we're organized. We have to be organized to do this.
Yeah, and just to add, what happened to American monuments, to that exhibit? What happened to it? It did not happen, right? And it was exactly about where we are today, right? Because it got stopped at a university. And that was before I got here. So that is a culture that we need to shift.
Thank you. So with the permission of whoever's giving me permission, I'm gonna we might run a little bit after 2:30. So for those of us in attendance, I'll cut it off pretty soon after. But I want to add, there's a couple of questions that came through the chat that I want to pose to you all. So I'm gonna pose maybe 5 questions, and again, if you could kind of go through them as fast, just to kind of give us some things to think about. I think so. I want us. This question comes from Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi, who is a professor in San Francisco State's Ethnic Studies Department and the program on Arab and Middle Eastern Studies in Ahmed. So I don't think she probably could answer this question best herself, but let me ask it anyway. She kind of wants to, she's asking about the relationship of policing across countries, and specifically she talks about the relationship of Israeli Defense Forces and the United States in terms of pushing forward different strategies of counterinsurgency. And then the question she poses is the notion of international solidarity for prison abolition as a global call rather than just the call in the United States. So that's one question. The second question I want to highlight is an interesting question that was asked by Silas Kim. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. They ask, a popular phrase used in social media is, quote, "arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor," unquote. This is obviously contradictory with the idea of prison and police abolition. Even if this sentiment comes from a cop or neoliberal in our heads, how do we reconcile this sense of justice or with abolition, right? So I think that's a very important question. If folks could respond to it. The next question comes from Caleb. Caleb asks, and I am losing where Caleb was. Sorry about that.
This might be my fault. I can jump in. I responded to Caleb because
so then
he's a student of mine. But the question was about confronting folks who are against abolition, like some suggestions for how to respond to people who say they're just against the idea of it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question, maybe there was a couple of questions around notions of increased policing, or I mean, specifically the person asked about the idea of black on black crime, or how crime statistics get put up, in a sense, every time we're talking about abolition. So how do we talk about the notion of criminality? I think we've addressed some of that by focusing our attention on structural issues around what produces crime rather than the individuation of why a specific crime occurred. But I just kind of want to pose those questions. So one about Breonna Taylor and asking for police to be jailed. Well, what does that mean within abolition? To international solidarity for prison when we're talking about abolition. Caleb's question about having these conversations with people around us, and the crime statistics part. So those four, I'm going to pose this to you all. After that, I have one last question for all the panel, and then we'll end the conversation because folks got to do things after this. Okay, so if you all could go.
I can kick it off again real quick, maybe. So I'm just going to keep the answers brief. Those are all good questions. I'll start by saying if you want to talk about this is I'm always happy to talk about. So come through my office or send me an email. We can figure out a time to discuss. But I would say I would answer like all of those questions together, except for I think the international question demands a little bit more specificity than I'm giving here. I think to go back to sort of my guiding principle, right, that like nobody's disposable is an easy way for me to sort of return out of those arguments that people stage, right? And so I often ask people, right, who aren't, pro carceral system or pro policing, even if it's under some sort of reform gesture, what makes a person disposable to them? What is the thing that somebody can do that makes you want to dispose of them? I try to resist sort of narratives of what if it was your brother, because it so often is, right? And so for so many of us have been harmed by people close to us who have had to take up an abolition politics, not because of it, in spite of it, right? So for those of us who have experienced harm, and I tell you, I have experienced plenty of harm in my life, right? So to take an abolition politics means to suggest that even under the most egregious stages of harm, right, there are, like Steve said, right, that there are ways in which that has been constructed beforehand, and the plots that let those kinds of violences emerge are the things that need healing, right? Those are the places that we need to go. And so by sort of focusing on the question of disposability, we start to get different things. So it's not just taking all the money from the police and spending it, right? It's spending it on programs and community support and organizations that will help us to move from a politics of disposability, a politics of the carceral state, back to a system of a welfare sort of system, mutual support, mutual aid. And I think those things sort of get to the broader things. As far as the crime statistics, right, that gets back to my sort of suggestion that encounters with the state raise crime statistics. Black people are policed at an egregiously amount higher, right, than other communities. So if you police a community 100% more than you police a different community, you have 100% more likely to see higher crime statistics, right? So I think that some of those can kind of be wrapped together in that, but I'm gonna pass it on for some other ideas.
I'll go next. The first question, right, thinking about the relationship between counterinsurgency and policing globally, right, between states that train other countries, right? When we think of the counterinsurgency tactics in Central America, right, the stuff I researched, you see that it was not only just the U.S. training counterinsurgency, it was also Israel training counterinsurgency in Central America, teaching them about tactics of death squads in Central America, right? The development of the U.S. border, right? Companies that build that are also transnational companies, right? So that's why I think in the very beginning that we started this conversation, we were trying to go global with this conversation, right? Looking at how capitalist states are causing the problems in our society, right? And go building off of what Abe just said, what kind of different system do we need that actually provides care to people, right? If we have a capitalist state that's about private property and private accumulation of wealth, maybe we need a different kind of state that provides care for people. Now, this could turn into a whole new debate that we're going to end pretty soon, so it can't be about, are you an anarchist or you're a socialist, or you believe in the state, do you not believe in the state? You can email me if you want to talk about that. But I personally do think we need a state that provides care, that provides healthcare, that could get us to something else. But in the meantime, we need something that provides healthcare, education, housing, right? Institutions that avoid having to rely on the police, right? I remember a few years back when the police in New York tried to go on strike, right? And they went on strike, but then the crime rate dropped. So then they went back to work, right? Because it started to get to a point where they're like, oh, actually, maybe we don't need you, right? This question about black on black crime, right? Think about that. Even at that point, when we're talking about defunding the police, people throw that at it. Well, what about black on black crime? That already in itself is already telling you that this person that you're talking to doesn't want to talk about defunding the police, or doesn't even want to try to have a conversation. They're already so ideologically predisposed to accept the conditions of their existence and not challenge it, right? That they'll start throwing all these reactionary statistics. Now, some people say, well, actually, there's a lot of violence within our intracommunal violence happening. Well, there's a lot of organizations doing anti-violence work that are never uplifted in these moments, right? So if anyone brings up to me, well, there's a lot of gang violence in your neighborhood, right? There's a lot of brown on brown violence, a lot of gang members killing each other. Well, actually, there's Homies Unidos is trying to stop that. There's Homeboys Industry trying to stop that. But they're also calling out the system that produced the problems, right? Policing is not calling out the system that produced the problems. It's maintaining the system that produced the problems, right? And so that's a very important to keep in mind, that when people bring up these statistics, you could say the same thing about white on white violence. White people die more at the hands of white people. Okay, what does that tell us? Nothing really. Just tell us that we live in a violent world that we need to reconstruct, right? But I think, if you look at the Malcolm X grassroots movement, they have a really good report on that, on black violence, and this trope of black on black violence, right? The Malcolm X grassroots movement, right? They had a report earlier back in the few 2010s, 12 about every 28 hours, right? African-American person is killed by the police or a vigilante, right? In there, they talk about that y'all want to throw black on black violence on us, but let's get to the point that even that itself is state sanctioned. And Abel just talked about that. When you have a closer relationship to the close proximity to the police, and you harass more by the police, more violence emerges because of that. So that's the relation to that. And then the last one, about the call to arrest the cops, right? Again, that you could say that, oh, that's different. That's against the idea of abolition. No, it's not, because again, it's calling out the system itself. Like, look, you're not even arresting the people that you're supposed to be arresting. They killed somebody, and y'all are letting them maintain their jobs and do their thing. It's really upholding the system, saying, look, y'all not even doing it. That's why we need an alternative, right? And so I think you could say that call and still ask for abolition, because abolition is about dismantling this and building something new, right? That's an important part here. Again, like I mentioned earlier, that Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis remind us, abolition is not just about eliminating this, it's about building this. So you could say, arrest the cops that killed Breonna Taylor, but I want more healthcare. I want more healthcare. I want more available, affordable housing, especially here in Los Angeles. We have a housing crisis, not because there's not enough homes, but because they're too expensive. And if all of us watching, there's 181 people in this 881, someone just left, 180 people here. You're not going to tell me that y'all are not struggling with housing. And if you're not struggling with housing, that must mean you own your home, but I'm sure you're struggling with your mortgage too. That's what we need to change. That's what we need to abolish the wage system. Let's go back to Karl Marx talking about abolishing the wage system, which is the capitalist system, transforming that thing.
Yeah, and I want to just say more about Breonna Taylor. It's like the practice. Breonna Taylor died because the police raided her home because they had a suspected gang member in which they've been surveilling the areas that she was living in, and deeming whoever they wanted as gang members, right, to police, arrest, and incarcerate people. And I know about some of this work because of my work in New York in public housing buildings, attempting to stop the raids, stop the gang raids that were happening, that were allowing the city to criminalize NYCHA residents so that they can deem them as a unreasonable tenant so that they can evict them, because real estate in New York is big, is huge. And so I think this really important to we have to not only just connect, we've been talking about communities, but they are all intersecting with these other parts of what it how we live, right? So I think it's the various connections that have been made have been very eye-opening and helpful for me too. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Just a couple of notes. So Dr. Abdulhadi corrected me. Thank you for that. She's from the program is Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies, AMED, which is in San Francisco State. And it's a program that is under threat and embattled, just like most ethnic studies departments are always under threat and embattled. And so I think that context is important in the answer that, in what we were talking about, given how does this framing work within the university system? Those are the very departments that have always attempted to answer these particular questions. And oftentimes they are put forward as departments that talk about particularities. Oh, this is a department of those people, and this is a department of those people, as opposed to ethnic studies as being departments that speak to universal conditions of race and white supremacy and colonialism. So just like sociology and anthropology and what have you ventriloquate as if they are speaking for the universal, ethnic studies department, regardless of what their names are speaking to the universal condition. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there. The Professor Dina Perron from Cal State Long Beach, thank you, Professor. She just quickly wanted to mention about the black on black crime. She says, when you remove policing tactics and solely look at violence and serious crime statistics, it is actually whites, and in particular white men. So that to push kind of what Dr. Osuna was saying, when that you could make an imminent critique of the argument being made, that the argument that being made around policing on itself falls flat because they are unable to do the very things that they say that they are doing, which is responding to criminality, so that they're not necessarily responding to criminality. So there's an imminent critique, meaning a critique of the argument itself falls apart because the logic of it doesn't come true. And what we are making is a transcendental critique, which is to say, abolish that logic altogether and develop a different project. So thank you, Dr. Perron, for that. And Michelle Saraseries, again, my apologies for these pronunciations. Michelle reminds us as well to remember the impact on Native nations whose territory along the borders are being threatened. A real issue right now with the build the wall mentality is the materiality of how those lands are being affected. So thank you for that reminder. I want to close off our panel, unfortunately, because we could hang out. I'm down to hang out for the rest of the day with everyone, but damn COVID. I want to end it with a question to all of you, maybe if you could respond very quickly, which is what are then, and we've been talking about this, but just to kind of put an exclamation point on everything that you all have said, and please raise anything else that you wanted to say. What are the steps that we should take as a community living in Southern California, as well as scholars, regardless of if we're workers, students, faculty, and staff, right? We're all scholars. We're all organic intellectuals, as Antonio Gramsci reminds us. So what should be our long-term vision, abolition maybe, and what should be our more immediate actions that we could take? So if you could maybe help us kind of think about what things we could do after we click off on Zoom.
Plug in. I'm surprised you're not plugged in. Plugged in. The Scholar Strike page has, tomorrow there's 2 panels with a lot of activists local in Long Beach and Los Angeles. I highly encourage people to follow those organizations, go to their events, ask how they can support, ask how they can assist those organizations, because they are doing the work. There are other organizations that are not part of this event, but the Los Angeles Community Action Network, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, Stop Los Angeles Police Department spying, Stop LAPD spying, and also Youth Justice Coalition are important organizations to contribute to in any way. We have a ballot measure for LA County, Long Beach is LA County, to reimagine LA. So to redirect funds from redirect certain governmental funds into investing into communities. Measure J. Folks are saying yes on Measure J. I will be voting yes on J. So just read about that. Eunice Hernandez is on the panel tomorrow from 5 to 7. They're part of Reimagine LA. I would just learn more from folks tomorrow as well.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you for letting us receive those resources. I think that's a good roundup, and I want to offer gratitude and thanks to you all. I think it's hard to constantly talk about the sort of life sucking parts of this. So it's nice to be in communities with folks who are thinking critically. And I think my advice, the answer, yes, Yusuf, is abolition is the goal. And I think abolition is also the means to the goal, right? So I think we start now, and we start with the things that you can capacitate, right, on your own. That's not engaging formal policing systems, that's resisting personal ones, it's resisting it in the classroom, in the home, in the logics, right, that we're talking about. And I think it's also, right, investing in Black, and for me, my personal interest, Black trans work, right, that's not about the sort of carceral state, right? We have a lot of that too, and you got to learn that, but it's also about supporting Black life, right? And we live lives outside of violence, and you can, sort of imagine how can you support it. And I'll just end with the question of, like, what do folks need to get there, right? Black folks need what everybody else needs. We need health and happiness, and that's what we're working on. It's very simple. So if it's something about the language of abolition that is turning you off, ask yourself why that is, right? Why that term makes you so uncomfortable, and then think about the history of what the term is trying to index, and imagine if maybe the thing that's making you uncomfortable isn't the term, but what it's bringing you back to, right? So thank you all for being here. To my colleagues, y'all are fire, y'all are the best. Thank you so much for letting me be in conversation with you, and to everybody in the audience and all of the organizers, I really appreciate your time, your labor, and your energy.
So, I'm always very inspired by a phrase that I learned from the Salvadoran student movement of the 1930s until now, a movement that fought a dictatorship, that fought fascism in El Salvador, right? And the phrase was estudio y lucha, meaning study and struggle, right? Study and struggle, estudio y lucha. And to me, and how I incorporate that, or how I think about that, is that we need to understand the conditions that we're up against to struggle against them. We need to study these conditions. Hopefully this webinar and discussion, we provided some links to different readings, different videos to watch, right? Hopefully you engage those things. Hopefully they weren't just links that were just posted, that you actually engage them, that you read them, that you studied them, that you hit up a friend. Hey, let's read this book together. Let's study this. I don't understand it. Let's email Dr. Osuna. Let's email Dr. Dozier, right? But I don't get it. Let's study this, right? Remember what Dr. Bakker said. Yeah, let's figure that out. I think that's an important point. Collective study of our problem, of the world that we live in, is very crucial, right? You could go out there and protest and chant, but if you're not understanding what you're up against, that's it just goes away. It's a momentary release. But we don't need momentary release. We need organization, right, to struggle against what we're up against, right? So against, if as Abe said, if you feel uncomfortable with that word abolition, look inside yourself. Why is it? What makes you uncomfortable about it? I always tell my students that you're going to take a class with me. What I need from you is to have an open mind and an open heart, right? You don't have to agree with me, because the class is not about agreeing with me, but just have an open mind and open heart to what I'm saying, So what are the frameworks that you're learning in my class? And what is it that might make you feel uncomfortable about them, right? So I really appreciate what Abraham just said, right? To be open to that. And I would push also in this current moment that what is socialism? What is communism? What are those words that have been so demonized in this country, right? That, again, we have the current president saying that we're never going to be this type of country. Well, I don't think the country we have right now is working anyway. We need something different. So again, I say study this stuff, but you know, look for community grassroots organizations in your community, in your neighborhood, because struggles are place-based. You have to find the struggle closest to you and build from there. Yeah, I really encourage all of us to do that, right? Even including myself, in self-criticism, I need to be part of these struggles too, right? So I really hope that whoever is still watching, that you organize yourself, be part of an organization, right? Because we need each other. We can't do this alone. The organizations out in the street catching hell can't do this alone, right? We all need each other to transform these conditions that we've been talking about. And to talk about these conditions is not to just be like, oh man, we're up against the law. We can't change it. No, it's to call it out and name it, and so we could transform it, right? So thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Like you same with y'all, you know, I'm stuck here, you know, parentally waiting for the child to arrive. But as I'm waiting for the child to arrive, I'm just stuck here. You know what I mean? So I'm excited that I was able to talk to y'all and share some ideas that, you know, I've been thinking about in this moment. So thank you.
I didn't get to say thank you, but thanks everyone. Much gratitude, much respect, much appreciation. This is a really great time to be together. So thank you. And thanks to everyone organizing it and being here with us.
Thank you all. And just as a way of closing, I want to remind folks some of the things that the folks who are organizing these 2 days have been putting forward as some steps that folks could take. So there's some stuff that's within the system type things, and those are make sure you register to vote and make sure that you take part in the census, because that's how they are trying to invisibilize many of us. And then outside of that, we are also folks are reminding us that there is a march against police violence here in Long Beach that is happening, organized by BLM Long Beach. That's happening at 3 p.m. at Recreation Park on 7th Street. There is also, in terms of the question of what ought to be done next, all of our events being put forward tomorrow will specifically address that question. So I invite people to show up to those events. All of that is on the website that I just posted, and you could get more information about that. Also, for students on this call and for everybody on this call, you know, we got to do what Beyonce says, which is get information, right? So join student organizations that are pushing for these issues, whether it's Black Student Union, La Fuerza, Students for Quality Education, the Anti-Racist Coalition at the Beach, which just started out of the Movement for Black Lives. And if those organizations aren't meeting your needs, then make up your own organization. So let's get organized, people, so we could continue having these conversations and continue reading the word and reading the world. So my thanks to everyone. Thanks to all of our support from Technology Services. And I want to end by proclaiming that Black Lives Matter. And not only that, by proclaiming that my life will only matter when and if Black Lives Matter, because it's a global call for all of us, right? So thank you all. And hopefully we'll see you on campus in real life sometime soon.